All right.
We're back.
We are back. I think this is episode 15, eh?
I'm not sure. I think I've lost track.
When I was putting some show notes together. Then,
show notes.
Yeah, I think I put the number 15
It should be, because we did 10 last year, and then this is essentially supposed to be for the month of May, but we've overshone by 1 week, but yeah, we're back.
We are back. Yeah. Okay. So the book, Slow Productivity, Cal Newport. So this is the second book that we're going through by Cal Newport. Yeah. The first one being Deep Work. Should I give us a quick intro?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Slow Productivity by Cal Newport is about the philosophy of slow productivity. Surprise. Which in turn is about, as the subtitle suggests, the lost art of accomplishment without burnout. It looks at the structure of work over time, from hunter-gatherers to not modern knowledge workers, focusing on the foundations of how we came to the point where we are working frantically on the edge of burnout. A point brought across in the early chapters is the idea that even though we look and are busier throughout each day, we aren't actually achieving more. It's what he calls pseudo-productivity. The book then goes on to discuss 3 principles that encompass the philosophy of slow productivity as an alternative. Those 3 things are: do fewer things, work at a natural pace, and obsess over quality. And yeah, that's what we're going to chat through.
Yeah.
Cool. Should we start with the introduction?
Yeah.
There's a core idea that he puts on page 7, where he says the core idea of this book is perhaps knowledge workers' problem is not with productivity in the general sense, but instead with a specific faulty definition of this term that has taken hold in recent decades. The relentless overload that's wearing us down is generated by a belief that good work requires increased busyness. Faster responses to email chats, more meetings, more tasks, more hours. So that's the general situation that we're in.
Yeah, I think it's a very, relatable point. I think, reading that, it was just me thinking back to be like, I think he did mention it in a few chapters, that the whole thing of, wanting to be online or seen online and all those kind of things give the impression that you're actually doing work when you might not actually do work. And I think it's just, I think we'll see it in the definition of what pseudo-productivity actually is. And it's like wanting to look busy without, and then that all of a sudden just takes over without us realizing it. But
the whole pseudo-productivity thing is, and we'll get to the definition that he gives later, but it's just the general idea of that we almost act busy, but we actually, and we are busy, not even acting maybe, it's that we are busy, but then we don't really achieve much because we're just so caught up in the busyness of things that we actually don't do anything that has long-term value.
Yeah.
Okay, so he gives a definition as well in the intro for slow productivity overall, and it's going to be very familiar, and we'll probably repeat it later again.
Yeah.
But on page 8 he says, a philosophy for slow productivity is a philosophy for organizing knowledge work efforts in a sustainable, meaningful manner based on the following 3 principles: do fewer things, work at a natural pace, obsess over quality. So those are the 3 principles of this philosophy. And then he goes on to say, this philosophy rejects busyness, seeing overload as an obstacle to producing results that matter, not a badge of pride. It also, I suppose we can skip that part, but just the general idea of saying, let's not focus on the busyness as the metric.
Yeah, I think, we'll talk about it in the following chapter. I think that's why it touches about it, that it's difficult to sort of I want to almost say quantify knowledge work to some extent, because there's no tangible output. If you're in the manufacturing sector, producing a certain number of things, what's judged as how hard you're working or not.
Yeah.
But yet in the knowledge sector, like you might end up doing a lot of things in sort of various different departments, more or less. And if you don't have anyone closely looking at what you're actually delivering, with a fine tooth comb, then they won't actually think, because they all judge it in the perspective of if they're not getting any work, that they require from you, then automatically they think you're actually not doing anything.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that definition of slow productivity, I think, is a way to sort of ground people. And I think later on they talk about visibility, trying to make sure that what you take on or work that you take on is kind of well communicated to everyone else.
Yeah.
I think that probably gives a good indication of where someone's at in terms of, what they're working on and what their output. And I mean, it has to be related with what the output in. But I mean, it takes time to sort of think through that. Yet, I mean, someone on the production line, they just have to make sure they output a certain number of units, and if someone's monitoring will be happy to be like, oh, okay, if their output has increased twofold, then that means they're working twice as hard.
Yeah.
But does that really mean they're working twice as hard? They could have just mitigated some, some things that they were doing poorly, and still put in the same amount of effort, but appears if they're working twice as hard.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things that he drills into and says, if you look at that industrial metric versus the metric for knowledge workers, we end up applying the industrial metric
subconsciously, and it
doesn't actually work out. So he's one of the things that he tries to do in this book is say, how can we escape from that? And this chapter now, that the rise and fall of pseudo-productivity, it actually digs into how the knowledge sector stumbled into what he calls the malfunctioning relationship with productivity. And because of that, industrial metric being applied. But he gives a good sort of overview of it, in part at least, on page 16. He says, for farmer productivity, the productivity of a given parcel of land can be measured by the amount of food the land produces. This ratio of output to input provides a compass of sorts that allows farmers to navigate the possible ways to cultivate their crops. Systems that work better will produce measurably more bushels per acre. This use of a clear productivity metric to help improve clearly defined processes might sound obvious, but the introduction of this approach enabled explosive leaps forward in productivity. So he's saying that productivity metrics in general are actually useful. And then he goes on page 18 to say, but when the knowledge sector emerged as a major force in the 20th century, the old notions of productivity that worked so well in farming and manufacturing didn't seem to apply to this new style of cognitive work. And then he carries on, he says, in knowledge work, by contrast, individuals are often wrangling complicated and constantly shifting workloads. And even if you wade through the swamp of activity to identify the work that matters most, then gives an example of a professor who has academic publications versus someone who is on councils and things like that, or committees, and which one is truly more productive. And the answer is very difficult to say this one or that one.
Yeah.
Because I think, going back to your point, the industrial metric, where you can basically measure almost instantaneously or within a span of a few weeks if it's farming, or maybe months, it's much more difficult to do that with knowledge work, because one, it often takes a lot longer, so that immediate metric isn't there. But then also a lot of the output is a bit more vague in terms of its end impact. It's similar to the idea of software developers, where it's like, what really, like if you were to try and quantify how much value adding this new page on a website would give, you can try and quantify things by what's the traffic that it produces and stuff, but all of those metrics are kind of very vague because you don't know what that leads to at the end of the day, like the sales and stuff down the line or the customer retention, all kinds of things.
I mean, we've even spoken about it deeper to say, I can write 10 lines of code and write that same thing in 5, you know.
Yeah.
Clearly, I've written more, I've worked more on it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that it's the most effective piece of code.
Yeah, and the less code often means that you've spent more time thinking about it and refined it, so it's less likely to have errors. It's normally easier to update, all kinds of different things.
Read, yeah.
But those kind of metrics are extremely difficult to track in that way. But yeah. So then he goes on to page 20, and he says, the knowledge worker cannot be supervised closely or in detail, argued Peter Drucker in his influential book, The Effective Executive. He can only be helped, but he must direct himself. And then it carries on to say, Drucker himself eventually grew to recognize the difficulties of pursuing productivity amid such autonomy, because he's just basically in his book, he said, we need to give people autonomy, but then he's like, okay, wait, hold on. Too much autonomy also has its problems.
Yeah.
And then later, it was from this uncertainty that a simple alternative emerged, using visible activity as a crude proxy for actual productivity. The more activity you see, the more you can assume someone's contributing to an organization's bottom line. Similarly, the busier I am as a freelancer or entrepreneur, the more I can be assured I am doing what I can to get after it. And then lastly, he says, it's safer to chime in on the email threads and jump on the calls than to put your head down to create a bold new strategy. So yeah, that's that idea of visible activity as a crude approximation for actual productivity. Yeah. Do you want to read that definition on 22?
Oh, okay. So I think the definition he's talking about is about pseudo-productivity, which is the use of visible activity as a primary means of approximating actual productive effort. I think you've kind of touched on it in the page before about how looking busy is what most people want to consider being busy. But yeah, I think as a chapter kind of is titled, the idea is kind of identified or not. Sorry, let me put it back. The idea is sort of put forth, but at the same time, he later says this is not actually the way forward, you know, and then essentially the book then tries to address sort of productivity.
And on page 25, he also goes on to say, like, that whole industrial metric thing obviously was a problem applying it, but then it's even made worse in the modern age where communication has become frictionless. So we can instantly send an email, we can instantly get on a call. And by doing that, now we have this problem where not only do we have this almost like warped incentive to show that we're doing something, but now we can actually easily fulfill that by jumping on a call or by even in the digital world.
And I think what he's trying to make us realize is how much that actually is a distraction for mainly for cognitive or knowledge-based workers.
Yeah.
You know, because I mean, they always say like it takes, what is it, about 20 minutes for you to like fully focus on what you're doing.
I don't know how long it is, but that idea of like switching your brain's context to be back into figuring out or thinking about that problem.
Yeah, so if you're distracted, it takes quite a long time for you to, and that's time lost. You know?
Yeah.
And essentially that's what an email notification does. It distracts you from, so yeah.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of things like that nowadays. But, So what's the alternative, Peter?
Slow productivity is the alternative.
So the next section, the next chapter, he goes on to discuss that slower alternative, slow productivity. And he starts off by explaining kind of how he came across this idea. So on page 31, he says, a seasoned activist and journalist named Carlo Petrini launched a new movement that he called slow food, and then goes on to explain part of the movement. And then he says the group promoted slow meals eaten communally, made from local and seasonal ingredients. So the idea is like you get fast food and then slow food, and pushing against this notion of everything needs to be faster. And sometimes, and it reminds me a lot of Oliver Berkman's 4,000 Weeks. And ironically, Oliver Berkman is the person who adds a little comment on the front cover. This idea of letting things take the time that they take. And just enjoying it, whether it's washing dishes or whether it's eating a meal and actually being present in that meal. And I think that's the general idea behind that slow food, all kinds of different things. They give examples of slow medicine, where it's rather than like quickly solving the problem when the problem arises, rather just taking a holistic approach. And then on 33 he says, Petrini, so the guy who, the journalist, didn't simply write a sharply worded op-ed about the corruptive forces of McDonald's. Instead, he promoted an appealing new relationship with food that would make fast food seem self-evidently vulgar. Those who suffer for others do more damage to humanity than those who enjoy themselves, Petrini explained. So, it's in order to get that kind of an idea across, a lot of people will just like slam McDonald's or whatever. But Petrini is presenting an alternative, and not only just presenting an alternative, but trying to help people to see that alternative is actually a better way of doing things. And the the current thing that most of us do is actually like terrible. And the reason why Cal puts that in here is because essentially he's wanting to try and do the same thing for productivity, to say, rather than just trying to absolutely pin it and achieve everything and do it all, take a step back.
And I think just to add there, he was trying to do that in a different perspective, not just say this is about productivity and everything that we talk about is around knowledge work in me trying to present my case. I think it was more, and I mean, I think we will see as we dig deep into the book that his examples are from very different sectors. I mean, from like the music industry, film industry, to like, scientists and, people from different fields, essentially saying like, this is what I'm proposing, but look, it's worked here, and it's worked here. So, for instance, this is one example of that he was like, listen, this is what's there, but let's look at food, for instance. This is what was presented, and then he marks what the advantages of slow food was over fast food. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so just maybe to repeat the slow productivity idea, and then explain what the book does as it goes through the different sections. So slow productivity, and this is the same as mentioned earlier, is a philosophy for organizing knowledge work efforts in a sustainable and meaningful manner based on the following 3 principles: do fewer things, work at a natural pace, obsess over quality. And we'll probably repeat that again a few times. And then each of those are broken down into a chapter. And they're fairly long chapters because that's all that the book has. Those that bullet point 3, that's the end of the book. And each of those 3 chapters goes through an explanation of the recommendation. So do fewer things example. And then justification for why it is needed for a sustainable work-life balance. And then he gives some propositions and ideas for implementing those propositions. And then he also gives interludes for self-commentary. I don't think we'll dig too much into the interludes, but he gives those as well. So that's how it's structured. And then maybe last thing from our side for the chapter is I'll give the example of Newton. Because you were mentioning a few of those examples. And one of them was Newton. So on page 43 it says, few people know, for example, how long it took Isaac Newton to develop the ideas contained in his masterwork, the Principia, over 20 years. They just know about his book once it was published, which changed science forever. The value of his ideas lives on, while the lazy pace at which they were produced was soon forgotten. Slow productivity supports legacy-building accomplishments, but allows them to unfold at a more humane speed. So, I'm pretty sure that, or actually I don't know if Cal would say that Newton was lazy in general. Like, I would assume that he wasn't lazy, but the important thing is that he didn't try and do things frantically either. Or at least when it came to major works like the Principia and that. They were not the only reason, but a very large reason of why they are such monumental works is because they were constructed over time. And like you said, there's a lot of examples that he gives in the book for that. That these major accomplishments that we think it's just the work of a genius, it's actually just someone who's, sure, maybe they're above average intellectually, but
the effort they've put in is bigger than in its eye. I think, sorry to cut you, the one thing that I usually tell people or in conversation is that I know this is completely unrelated, but it comes to when you're comparing yourself to someone. You only see what's presented to you, but you actually don't know what it took to get there, and that's essentially what he's saying here, that, we so focused on Newton, was able to deliver this piece of work. But you then don't, fair enough, we don't always get the chance to kind of, okay, now that I've read your book, so how long did this book take you? What did you go through? We just on the receiving end. But what that makes us feel is that, no, if they were able to do it, I need to, crunch, to come up with the same thing. But he's trying, what it tries to convey in the chapters, the 3, which kind of explain the 3 points about slow productivity, is that, no, like, and you said this before, take a step back, try and properly define what it is that you want to do, and then, go forth from there.
And he even starts and closes off the book with the example of John McPhee. So John McPhee, I don't remember all the details, but essentially there's an example where he's sitting on the table or lying on the table, staring at the ceiling and kind of like just pondering things. And then it's like, well, obviously this guy's not going to be productive because he's just like sitting around thinking about things. But then it goes on to explain how he was working on this one article and it came together because of those, him taking the time. He had a bunch of ideas scattered around, but he couldn't find a thread through them. Then he eventually figures out a thread and stuff like that. And then he produces this article, and it's a good article. And then if you look at the short time span, then he doesn't seem very productive. But then if you look at the long time span, I can't remember if he had like some very successful books as well and articles and all kinds of things. But he was, by what Cal would say is by anyone's measurements, if you look at the long time scale, he is a very productive person. But if you look on the short time scale, it doesn't look like it because it seems like he's just sort of spending his time, for lack of a better word, faffing around. Yeah. Okay, should we go on to the 3 principles of slow productivity?
Yes, let's.
Cool. So the first one is do fewer things. So maybe I'll start off with the definition. So on page 53, he gives a definition where he says, to do fewer things is to strive to reduce your obligations to the point where you can easily imagine accomplishing them with time to spare. Leveraging this reduced workload to more fully embrace and advance a small number of projects that matter most. So choose the things that matter most and give them time that they take.
Yeah. I want to say this is a sort of a principle that we looked at in what book was that? 24 hours.
How to live in 24
hours. You know, it was kind of that as well. Like you properly define what you need to focus on, and you then decide when you're going to do that. Like, if you have a 9 to 5, you should be respectful enough to be like, if I'm going to do anything for myself, I do it outside of my 9 to 5, and you know, and I think he kind of later on tries to bring across this idea that doing fewer things doesn't mean doing less. I think that's what. I know it sounds like it's contradictory, but what I mean by that is that it doesn't mean if I'm doing fewer things, I don't still work my 8 hours. Let's say if we're looking at the conventional thing. What it means is within those 8 hours, be very selective on what you're going to do within those 8 hours. You know, and I think later on, I don't know if it's in doing fewer things, it talks about projects, and he was like, at a given time, have at least 3. If you push it beyond that, you're just asking for trouble. At most 3. Yeah, at most 3. That's at least 3. At most 3. Sorry. At most 3. If you have more than that, you're just asking for trouble. So it's the doing fewer things is not necessarily doing less. You know, it's just being very cognizant about what it is that you're picking up and what you focus your attention on. You know?
Yeah. And I don't think it's that he would completely say you shouldn't do less, because I think it's also like what we would say is doing less is someone like John McPhee lying on the table. We'd be like, I mean, clearly he's not working. But Cal would say, no, that is work. Especially in the knowledge sector. But there's a difference between lying on the thing and watching YouTube and lying and actually trying to think through the problem and trying to
but hence why what I'm trying to say is that if you identify something, it doesn't matter what the state in which you are in terms of doing that thing. Like, if you're saying, for instance, for John, like, sitting down was sort of part of his process, because in him sitting down or laying down on the table looking up in the sky, he wasn't like, he didn't have his mind wander onto something completely unrelated to what he was working on. It was him, if you want to think about it in terms of deep work, having a blocked off and him thinking deeply about the problem at hand.
Yeah.
So it's still part of what is required, or what his job entails, or what his end goal is. It's just that on an outsider's perspective, like I say, we'll look at that person and be like, oh, but this person's just been lazy. But in actual fact, they're actually thinking through what they actually need to do.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's the same thing that we said earlier, that if someone writes code in a few lines, they've actually thought through the process, you know. And how does that happen? There will be chunks of time of you actually being idle, but it doesn't mean you're not working at the task at hand. It's just that there's nothing to show for it, but you're actually working, but internally, if I may. You know, so I'm just...
Literally happened to me yesterday. I'm like, this is such a complicated problem to solve. And then I'd like tried it in a few different ways. And then eventually I realized like, oh, I can just filter these items out in this way. And then the rest is super simple. And it's just, it's great when that happens.
Yeah.
'Cause you're like, oh man.
Yeah.
That's, because you somehow, when those problems come up, you kind of know intuitively, like, okay, this is the answer, but then to actually formalize that answer is very difficult. Yeah. And it kind of goes to something that we'll touch on later. I'll read through the example as well. But there's a example where they essentially talk about the difference between your knowledge of whether something is beautiful, or like being able to say like this is well done, or this is
it's about taste.
Taste is the word that they use. So having good taste versus actually being able to produce something that is of that level of taste. And those are two different things. And it's a similar idea in a lot of fields, I assume, but definitely in coding, where you can easily recognize high quality, well-written code, but to produce that code is very difficult. And if you just think about it, you can often like, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure I could come up with that solution. But then you actually try and do it, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm a few decades of experience behind this. Anyway, something else about doing fewer things was, he uses the example of Jane Austen. So she's a famous novelist. And he says here on page 53 at the top, Austen was not able to produce creatively during the crowded periods of her life. It was only when, through circumstance and contravenience, I guess is the word, her obligations were greatly reduced, and that Austen was able to finally complete her best work. This lesson, that doing less can enable better results, defies our contemporary bias towards activity. But recall that busy Jane Austen was neither happy nor producing memorable work, while unburdened Jane Austen, writing consistently at a quiet Chawton cottage, transformed English literature. Yeah. Don't do busy work. Do meaningful work. There's a biggest chunk of text that I think might be useful to read on page 56. Okay. And it's about the common state of overload that we find ourselves in. So I'll read through it. Bear with me. In knowledge work, when you agree to a new commitment, be it a minor task or a large project, it brings with it a certain amount of ongoing administrative overhead, back and forth email threads that need to gather information, for example, or meetings scheduled to synchronize with your collaborators. This overhead tax activates as soon as you take on a new responsibility. As your to-do list grows, so does your total amount of overhead tax you're paying. because the number of hours in the day is fixed, these administrative chores will take more and more time away from your core work, slowing down the rate at which these objectives are accomplished. He goes on to say at the end, you're busy as you've ever been, and yet hardly anything gets done. So I think we end up often in that state where we keep on doing these lots of little tasks and stuff like that. And then we have to organize the meeting, and that's a little bit of extra work. And then we have to summarize some notes from it, or there's some extra work that gets output from it. And all of those little things lead to this common state of overload. And then on page, this is maybe jumping ahead a bit, but on page 62, he then says, how knowledge workers decide when to say no is they tend to rely on stress as the default heuristic for moderation. And so what that is saying, he's saying don't do that, by the way. So we get into this situation where we're doing all of these things and they have massive overhead tax and we don't even really account for it. We don't think about it. We just find ourselves extremely busy. And then it's only when we get super stressed that we're like, oh, okay, we need to back off here. And he's saying that should not be the metric that we use, the heuristic that we use. We should rather take active steps earlier to narrow our focus on a small set of tasks. The common number is 3 for no real particular reason. It's just a number that often people settle on. Which
goes back to what I was saying. Do few things, but not less.
Yes. Yeah. And there's example that he gives you. A coach named Laura, for example, reported that she simplified her practice by reducing her offerings down to a few key services. So it's not like you have to do complicated things, but you can have 1,000 products. And then the Steve Jobs example of saying like, okay, but we don't need all of these products. It's much more difficult to maintain. It's much harder to sell to people because like they don't know what they need.
Yeah, if you give them that they need this, have a better chance of buying that than giving them the option.
Yeah,
I mean, when sorry if this will offend people, but in a world where clients don't know what they want, they'll come with you that they have this brilliant idea, but then they tend to you to be like, okay, so what's the solution? They'll have all these grand ideas, which are sometimes impossible. And then you have to kindly be like, listen, rather than that, this is what, can be done.
And a lot of clients are like that, where it's just like spamming these random things and it's like a vague idea. But then on the other hand, at the moment, I'm fortunate, the client that I work with is very, they understand the business domain very well. And so the solutions to the problems that they present are extremely good. Because it's like, they know
this is what we're facing, we need a solution.
And it kind of goes back to that like idea of doing fewer things and focusing on them. Because this client in particular, they started the business and then they've grown it to the point where it is now, and they've been focused on that for over 10 years at this point. And so they understand that business domain extremely well. And so that concept of doing fewer things and producing more value, like it adds up in a lot of different domains, even in that domain of the client saying, okay, what do I want? And then being able to express it clearly. And then if the requirement is fulfilled or not, they can say, okay, yeah, it is or it isn't. And if it isn't for some reason, it's giving clear directions of what to fix and things like that. And that's, sorry, last comment on this blabber, but I watched a thing on Jensen Huang, the NVIDIA CEO, and he was saying he doesn't really like firing people. He rather likes to invest time in people because he thinks that like most people are able to achieve remarkable things and stuff given the effort and time. there's a risk there, of course. I'm not going to go into caveats. But the thing that he then raises is he says what he really likes is when people are tenured. So when people have spent a lot of time at a place, like a tenured professor, the value there is because they've spent time really coming to grips with the problems and the potential solutions, and they can see things that other people can't see. And there's so much value there in being tenured, spending time and really investing in getting to know something well so that you can solve problems much more effectively. The client is a good example of that. Jensen is a good example of that in NVIDIA. There's lots of good... In fact, I think both the current Microsoft CEO, the current Google No, I'm not sure about I think the current Google CEO as well, and the current Facebook CEO are all people, and obviously the NVIDIA, like I just mentioned, are all CEOs that have been tenured. They've spent crazy amounts of time. A lot of them, Jensen and Mark for Facebook and NVIDIA, they're founders, so they've know stuff from the ground up. And I think the Facebook and Google CEOs have been there since they've started working there, and they've been there for, I don't know if it's 20 years plus, but a long time at those companies. And now are the CEOs, and now are doing incredible things, in part, I think, because of that perspective. Yeah. I will stop there. Okay. Should we go on to the propositions?
Yeah.
So, inside of Do Fewer Things, he gives these propositions, and the propositions are kind of what he proposes one should do in order to achieve doing fewer things. So in each of these chapters, he gives propositions in order to say, how do you go about achieving that part of the slow productivity philosophy? And inside of those propositions, he gives ideas. So I'll give a high-level overview, and then we can dig into them. But the propositions are limit the big, contain the small, and pull instead of push. So we can look at limit the big and how to achieve that. So limiting the big. I have a note on page 70. The first thing is limiting missions. So there's three inside of limiting the big. How do you achieve that? Limit missions, limit projects, limit daily goals. And those are three different time scales. So Cal likes to often deal with time scales. So these are three different time scales at which you should try to limit the big. So one is limiting missions, and a mission, for our purposes, he says, is an ongoing goal or service that directs your professional life. Yeah. So to use the client example, it would be that their business that they've started and running that business well and stuff, that might be them one of their big missions. For Cal, one of his big missions would be probably, I assume, I'm not 100% sure, but writing a book. Like
I think he'll just say it was like writing and his professor duties and being, let's say, on a committee or something. Just to add in that, what limit missions speaks to is about kind of in your, let's say, and I also feel like this applies to your general life as well, and I think it's probably good practice is to sit down and identify as a person what is it that you do. Like at the end of the day, what does that look like? You know, so like for instance, you know, it'll be like I'm a software developer, you know, again, like I'm involved at church, and then other thing that those are kind of my primary missions, if I may, and then kind of be aware that if someone says, oh, and then like maybe in like on a leisure scale, it would be like something like hiking. So it would be like those are things I know that within a month, those are things that I need to sort of tick a box to. So when I pick up something new, I need to then say like, how much more effort does this require, and is it necessary for me to actually bring this on?
Yeah.
And let's say once you've identified that can then, you can further drill that into your actual work. That, okay, at work, from 8 to, let's say, 5, what am I required to, like I said, I'm a software developer minimum, that my missions are to deliver certain amount of work. At the end of the day, I'm required to, okay, not my role, but let's say if it's a project manager, they're required to schedule meetings, run meetings. They know that those are their missions. The moment someone says, come, you need to organize this, and that, that's well and done if it's short term. But let's say if they bring on something new, you then need to sit down and evaluate whether that will affect the missions you have on hand and not exceed the number of missions that you have on your plate.
And I think maybe some of the stuff that you were talking about more falls into the project or daily tasks categories. But I mean, the general principle is, you want to limit the number of missions. And he says it's not, there's not a specific number he can recommend. If you were to thumbsuck, he might thumbsuck 3. But he would say generally less is more. Because the less you have, the more you can focus on them. Remember, this is the whole broad category is do fewer things. And this is one way to achieve that. Then the next one is limiting projects. So the slightly smaller version of that. And he says here, missions require that you initiate projects, which is my term for any work-related initiative that cannot be completed in a single session. So missions are more like what are your life goals almost? And projects are more like, okay, part of my mission of running a good company is going to result in a project to make sure that the company culture is good, a project to make sure that the quality of code that we produce is high, to set up an HR department or whatever these different projects are. And the projects are normally going to last for a little while. And
they kind of have an end, if you may.
Exactly, whereas the missions are more like just forever or for your lifespan.
I want to look at it that, and this might be extreme, but your missions are more what you identify as.
Sure,
and then
bringing in some atomic habits, eh?
It's more what you identify as. Your projects are more kind of your short-term goals, if I may, but not really short, but
it's like things that you need to achieve to achieve your mission.
So things that are within your mission, but kind of have time frames within them.
And so limiting those also important because in order to achieve your mission, you cannot do an infinite amount of projects because if you do an infinite amount of projects, then the overhead tax is going to be too high. Okay, then limiting daily goals is the last one. So on 75, he says there, my recommendation here is simple. Work on at most one project per day. To clarify, I don't intend for this single daily project to be your only work for the day. You'll likely also have meetings to attend to, emails to answer, administrative nonsense to subdue.
I did overlap missions and goals, but
so those daily goals, limiting those is vital. And he says, okay, in the context of missions and projects, your mission breaks down into projects. Your projects then, you should only focus on one a day. To carry on with the example, which is completely made up, but you're starting your company, that's your mission, is to have a good solid company, and your projects in there, one is the HR department, setting up a good HR department. Today might be the day where you focus on that, but you shouldn't focus on that and then also focus on setting up good code structures and practices or something like that. Because if you do both of those, what Cal's claim is that you aren't actually going to achieve more. You're just going to be caught in this like flipping between different things, context switching, and not making good progress. And he says on page 76, to wrap it up, he says, fueled by the impatient ambition of youth, I wanted to make progress on as many things as possible at the same time. I was, of course, wrong, and she was right. There was a calibrated steadiness to working on just one major initiative a day. Real progress accrues while anxiety is subdued. This pace might seem slow in the moment, but zooming out to consider the results that eventually accrue over many months reveals the narrowness of this concern. So, don't focus on too many things at once. And in his groupings, focus on one project a day at maximum. And you will have other meetings, and maybe the meetings relate to other projects and things like that. And that's somewhat fine. But in terms of your actual focused deep work, to use his earlier phrase, focus on one project at a time. Okay. Should we go on to contain the small?
Yeah. That's the next position. Proposition.
So again, still within the do fewer things category. So we limited the big. Now we want to contain the small. He says here on page 78, or actually no, I'll skip over that. Let me just go 76 and 82. So he says here, small tasks in sufficient quantities can act like productivity termites, destabilizing the whole foundation of what you're trying to build. It's worth going to great lengths to tame them. Yeah. I don't know that too much needs to be said about that general idea, but if we don't contain those small tasks, there's productivity tax, but there's also just the actual tasks themselves just chew away so much time that, end up doing nothing by doing everything.
Again, and that is essentially business.
You
know, and there's just too much that you can't, then you become paralyzed to actually do anything, you know.
Okay, so that's just a high level of what he means by contain the small. So he's specifically talking about small kind of tasks and things like that. And then he gives 5 ideas for how to contain them. So put tasks on autopilot, synchronize, make other people work more, avoid task engines, and spend money. So put tasks on autopilot. On page 83, he says, the idea was to assign regularly occurring classwork to specific times on specific days, and sometimes even specific locations and each week.
I like the idea of that. You know, it's like you kind of put something in place that over time everyone is aware that needs to be done.
Yeah.
You know, I felt, that was a good thing. Like, it's as easy as, let's say, tutorial session is in this block on this day.
Yeah.
You know, you introduce it seems like, okay, but then over time, it's become second nature to people that, okay, at this time, this person runs that. And I think for you as an organizer as well, it becomes that as well, that you almost immediately know that that's a time that needs to be set aside for something.
Yeah. It's I one of the things I'd really like to do, I currently do it at the end of the week, but it's difficult to be consistent with it. But I'd really like to do like timesheets and those kind of things at the end of each day. So it's just like almost. So I think in his deep work book, Cal talks about having a end of day routine, like a shutdown routine. And I think one of the things I'd like to do is like tack the timesheets on as my shutdown routine, because then it's quick to do. You don't have to think about it. It's not something where it's like, oh, I need to do my timesheets at some point. And it's like 5 minutes and then you're like, cool, I'm done with the day.
I was going to say, and what word do you scream out? Because
I'm trying to remember.
I thought you have your own word, but I think it was like shutdown complete or something.
It was shutdown complete. It was
something very...
like very stark. Shutdown complete.
Yeah,
and he says there in the putting things on autopilot, containing tasks is not about escaping the small. Instead, it's about making these efforts as painless as possible. So, like, we have to do our timesheets, or at least I do. And it's not difficult and complicated, but it can take up unnecessary mental space.
Trust me, I've gotten bad at it. And you saying that, I need to be better, because when you leave it towards the end, it's like then you have to think through on this day, what is it that I did? I mean, it's easier if you've been working on like big tasks, but if your work is like broken up into small chunks, that can be. I mean, as we've read, that's a pain, those small tasks, but
Yep. And I think also it's not just like that, like using a calendar to put things on autopilot. I think there are other examples. I can't think of ones now, but just generally having things happen automatically. I mean, maybe a different one would be at the end of each month, like on the first day of the new month, having if you have money pockets in your bank account, to have it automatically transfer to the different money pockets or savings thing, or automatically, or set up debit orders that automatically take the money off and things like that.
Was that like from the Philosophy of Man? There was a book that we read about tasks and like certain things that what book was that now?
It could have been The Psychology of Money.
That you just need to
I think it was with the investment advice, where you just have it automatically debit.
But I mean, that principle is also said to a lot of things, that there's certain things that you can have automatically done.
It's probably Cal Newport's deep work.
Oh, is it that as well?
If I was to hedge my bets. It could have even been
your favorite author.
Hidden potential. I do like him. But I think deep work is still, I don't know if this one or deep work's my favorite. I think I like both for different reasons, but if I had to suggest one, actually it depends on the person I'm suggesting to.
It depends on what sticky situation they're in. Because they're all like life-saving lifeline type of books.
If someone's like a sort of they don't actually work really well and stuff like that, then I would be like, okay, maybe deep work makes more sense. But if someone's like overworking and things, then slow productivity makes,
again, like I said, opposite ends of the spectrum.
So both. Okay, containing the small. So we've talked about autopilot. Then we the next one is synchronize. So there's two different parts of synchronizing that he's talking about. One is setting up something like office hours. So essentially synchronizing, and that's on 88 and 89. He talks about basically synchronizing when people are able to interrupt you and things like that. So that's the idea of setting up office hours, announcing it that everyone knows. In his context, obviously that makes a lot of sense because he's a professor. But in our context at work, like it can also be just like, cool, those are the times if you want to chat to me, like those are the times that I'll be like really available. I'll try and like keep aside. But the other times I'm going to be working for different people.
It's more like making aware that, okay, I'll only respond to emails at this hour and whatnot. And, so.
And then
I think the important the important bit is to make people around you aware that that's when what happens.
Yeah.
Because there's no point in you setting that aside and then just keeping it yourself. You know?
Yeah.
I think that's where the synchronization kind of comes from, you know. Yeah.
Yeah. The other one is to schedule check-ins with the team. I think that we kind of, in the software world, there's a few things I'll probably mention it again when it comes to another point, but when it comes to software development, we do daily stand-ups, and I think it kind of naturally in the software world we have some of these principles embedded into how we work, through the agile methodologies and Scrum and things like that. But I think it's cool to see, because if you don't come from the software world, these are super helpful principles to say have regular check-ins so that everyone on that team knows what everyone else is doing, where they stuck, where they're not, and do that in a regular standard way.
You'd be surprised though, like many other fields also do that. They just name them differently.
Sure, yeah.
And I think the only thing that I like in our industry is that we try to... The only thing. So, I mean, with regards to the synchronizing part, it might be the only thing. Kidding. I think.
So many caveats. Sorry, I interrupted you there.
It could be that we keep them short.
Yeah.
In my team, we keep stand-ups to 15 minutes, you know?
Yeah, well, we try.
Yeah. But you find that, I have friends that, I had a friend that just worked for the government, and he would say he would have daily meetings where people align, but this would just take hours and hours on hand.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like the idea is there, but the execution is just off. You know, and I think that's what he's trying to drive across, to be like, it's all well to have catch-ups, but just, you know, and I think somewhere he talks about blocking off times in like half-an-hour intervals, you know, just making sure that that's kind of the maximum thing that you sort of block off. And yeah, I forgot him, but it's probably another section where it talks about if you block off this for a meeting, block off a certain amount of time of productivity, but that's later in the book. No, that's later in the book, in the other parts of, but yeah, we'll get to that. But yeah, just having your teams align, you know, I think is very important. And just like I said, just making that known as well, that those are the times in which people can touch base with you, then is very vital, you know.
Yeah. The next thing in containing the small is, or next idea to try and achieve containing the small, is to make other people do more work. I really like this principle.
That's my favorite.
Like, because, so he says, in general, strategies that require people to do more work can prove effective for containing tasks, which I think is true. But the reason why I like the idea so much is because often what we'll end up doing, especially if you go towards like a management type position or something, is we will try and do everything. And you get to a point where you realize you actually can't. And then one of the things that you can do is to get other people to do more work. His context here is slightly different. His context is saying, get people to do more work if they want to give you a task. But he, in another book, he talks about how, for example, the idea of, it doesn't quite relate. I was going to say the idea of when you're writing an email, put in more effort to make sure that the other person doesn't have to...
He does speak about this in this book as well.
Yeah.
He does that, kind of leave no room for questions type of thing. You kind of write an email knowing that I want to say bulletproof almost, just to kind of be like, this is all you need, you know, to minimize back and forth that even if someone comes back with something, it's kind of either you missed it in your initial email or something, but just making sure you cover your bases.
Yeah.
You know, when you... Yeah, but that context is a bit different, you're saying. But again, sorry to...
No.
Like, I also like that principle of how... I think it's very easy to go down that rabbit hole of, oh, I can help you with that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've never been in a position to, let's say, manage a group of people, so I don't really know the extent of what's further. But I, on the other hand, understand, especially with the example that he gave, it's like, no, you can have all that done before you bring it to me.
Yeah.
You know, instead of me printing it, then I take it back to you to fill in something. Then I take it back.
That's the example he gives.
That's the example he gives. But rather, like, have a power that this comes in, you know, I do what I need to do. It goes out, and then you do the submission yourself.
Yeah,
you know?
he used to print them all out, like these forms. He used to print them out and sign them. Now he just gets the people who want the form signed to print them out,
do what they need to sign, and then
he just has to sign them and move them to another pile, and then that's all.
The person who submitted it needs to then come collect their form and do the submission themselves.
Exactly, yeah.
You know, so yeah.
And I think that's a really helpful strategy. And then, but one of the reasons I really like it is because it actually helps people to, especially if you think about, say, for example, someone is struggling with a task and then you go to help them, then if you do a lot of the work for them, then they won't actually learn as much. And so one of the reasons I really like it is because it does two things extremely well. One, it reduces the workload that you have to do drastically. And the other is that it actually upskills other people because you aren't actually doing the work for them. They have to do that work.
Yeah.
And another example was like a while ago, and my boss said this to me, and it was a very simple thing, but it's a super helpful idea. I was trying to think about organizing all this stuff for someone who wanted to work towards a promotion. And coming up with like a massive document of all the things that they need to do and thinking about like, okay, where are their weak points and what are their strengths and all these and what do they need to improve on and what can they do to then go and improve on those things and all kinds of stuff. And she said, well, why don't you get them to rather set that up? And I was like, oh my goodness. Like, it's so simple, but it's getting them to do more work, but they also then are more invested in that because it's not me dictating to them what they need to do. It's them being like, oh, those are my shortfalls. And of course, giving a guide for like, this is maybe what a junior and a senior or in between looks like. That's fine. Don't just like leave them out on the ditch.
Yeah, like, I mean, if there's something they've missed, you then identify or kind of say, why don't you also look at this and that? Yeah. And yeah, like you're saying, you're more, and I think that also allows them to do the reflection to identify, oh, what am I? Because again, it goes back to the previous book we read about criticism and advice.
Yeah.
Because when you taking it to them and be like, it's more criticism than, you know, them or you saying, like, just advising them that maybe you should, you know, include this because they've come already with like, this is where I kind of am at. And then you kind of say, oh, also consider this, and that, you know, that difference, you know, that mind shift seems subtle, but the impact of it is, you know, unimaginable, you know,
Yeah, and maybe a last thing on this is, if approached in the wrong way, then like the whole idea of making other people do more work is a terrible idea. But if approached in the right way, it's not just, and Cal says this somewhere, it's not like an indulgent thing.
It does. He used a word that I was like, okay, I don't think that's very, but it's more like, humble yourself kind of thing, so that it seems like they're actually doing you a solid.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the... I don't necessarily agree with, because I think that, like, for me, that approach is realizing I'm still fine to do things that are annoying and difficult and stuff like that, if on the whole it's more beneficial for me to do it. But I think realizing now more and more that if I do something, it's not always the right thing to do. It's actually can be beneficial for the other person for me to give them work.
Yeah, it's more of trust inside. I think there's also, I think we've read so many books. It's more of empowerment, empowering them, so they feel empowered to actually, then they feel more invested and actually get the work done. You know? And like I said, it can be more beneficial than anything. Yeah, I think it says, in reality, however, if you're diplomatic in your phrasing and people sound interpretation, you can introduce the system without attracting too much.
Yeah, I think for his example, that makes sense. But, yeah, it's funny.
Oh, man.
Okay, then should we go to the next one on containing the small? Yeah. Avoid task engines.
Clearly, we all want other people to do our work for us.
Yeah. Just be diplomatic about it.
Self-deprecate. Avoid task engines.
So also with regard to containing the small, avoid task engines. And he says, when selecting new projects, assess your options by the number of weekly requests, questions, or small chores you expect the project to generate. Prioritize options that minimize this number. So, in the summary, don't choose tasks that are task engines. You don't want to choose things that will just generate tons of tasks.
Okay.
Choose things to do that won't generate a lot of tasks but are valuable. Yeah. Last one for containing the small is spend money.
Yeah, that... I think that one's not... How can I put it? That needs to be drilled into people more, if I'm to be honest. And, I mean, the evidence of how it works out is, phenomenal. Like, it's... And I was actually thinking about it on how this even applies to employees. The whole cheap labor and actually taking the time to identify a strong candidate and be willing to pay what they're asking for, is part of spending money.
Yeah.
And you don't have to, I mean, maybe it's about mixing and matching, but if you're able to, if you're in a fortunate position to afford, of course, after doing your due diligence, of course, I think rather opt to spend the money than, to make profit. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we too quickly will buy, silly things, and instead of spending money on things that are actually valuable, we just don't want to spend money on tools that add value to our lives. We always want to go with the cheap free alternatives. I think the example that they give here is a bit extreme. Like that person spends I don't know if it's close to
$400.
I think it was something like $5,000 or something silly.
No, it was $2,400.
$2,400.
Still a lot of money. I'm not.
Yeah, 2,000. Sorry. Yeah, my maths was just off. Because I just remembered in my mind it was about 50,000 rand.
Yeah.
So, that is absurd. Most people aren't even earning that.
Yeah.
Never mind being able to spend that on tools.
Yeah.
But I think I think if you have, it doesn't, the amount of money you spend isn't the point. The point is that if you can, for example, you can buy a software product that's, I don't know, 100 Rand, but instead you're using the free alternative and the 100 Rand one is actually better, spend the 100 Rand.
I think move away from paying for products, because that's also, I think he later then also adds about, rather than you chipping out on legal HR, hire someone or pay someone that is in that field to actually do that. So the spending money is not just, that's why I added that, not just paying for products, but actually paying employees more, spend more, or finding someone, like, I think he talks about it, he doesn't do the books himself, he employs someone to do his books. So it's in that regard that...
To do his books? Oh, accountant. Yeah, I was like, I'm sure he writes his own. Yeah. And he says there's something along the lines of every effective entrepreneur knows that they need to do that. They can't do all of those little tiny admin things. Yeah. Definitely agree there. Okay, last proposition within the realm of do fewer things is pull instead of push. So it says on 101, switching to a flow or switching the flow of the genetic sequencing process from push to pull. In a push-based process, at each stage pushes work onward to the next stage as soon as it's done. In a pull-based process, by contrast, each stage pulls new work only when it's ready for it. At Broad, I think that's the company, this pull-based methodology was implemented in a simple manner. Each stage managed a tray to place on the completed samples. The next stage would then pull in these new samples from that same tray. So it's kind of like a production line thing that they're using there. And it seems like there shouldn't be much of a difference because the amount of work at the end of the day is the same. Like, if I push work onto you, or if you pull the work, there's the same amount of work, right? It's just like me pushing that work onto you or you pulling it. But the idea, and he goes on to it later, is, but you can, that tray can stack up.
Yeah. And that's where the problem comes.
And you don't have to task switch the whole time. And that produces a massive amount of productivity increase because of the fact that now you're not trying to do too many, like you can only do so many things at a time, and switching to that pull-based approach makes that more visible. And then if you picture a production line, and I think they use this example, if you picture a production line and you have maybe call it 3 stations, and station 1 is finishing work at a rapid pace, and station 2 is very slow, and station 3 is finishing work at a rapid pace. You can easily then look at the production line and see, oh, station 2 is the slow station. And then you can do things, whether it's adding multiple sets of the station 2 to produce, to like have those things be processed in parallel or something like that.
I think in this example, he was like, you then use the resources that are free to help out. He used this even in the software industry, that you can also have that pull approach where you pull work, or you set aside chunks or time spans, and in those spans, if the work isn't finished but some resources or some people are free or have completed the work, then they can assist to get things over the line. Same thing with what you said in the production line. You assess that, because I think the mistake they made was they didn't realize that other stations would be slower than others. So at first they were just receiving all these samples, and the quick people were like churning this out, and then when it gets to the slow bit, then it will pile up to the point where people would take days looking for samples and all that kind of stuff. But when using the pull method, people were, it was in that sense that pretty much the productivity or the how can I put the speed, if I may, of the production line was determined by the slowest station.
Yeah.
So and this is regardless of where the slow station occurs, because at any point it kind of, not really a bottleneck, but it will set the pace of the whole product, because work can only progress.
I think it is a bottleneck.
It is a bottleneck. Work can only progress by how quickly the slowest people pull in work.
Yeah.
And it avoids pile-up, because people that have a food tray in front of them are forced to stop up until there's an available slot in which to shift a new thing on. And yeah, like I said, that then enables the people sitting idle to then be kind of deployed ahead to assist in completing the sort of backlog that exists there. But yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, again, in the software world, it's done quite well. So we have this idea of sprints, and they're normally 2-week cycles. Sometimes they're shorter and longer, but most companies do 2-week cycles. And then we have this idea of a backlog. And you basically commit to 2 weeks worth of work by pulling things from the backlog into the current sprint. And then you work on those for 2 weeks, and then you start a new sprint. And if there's new things that come up, they are supposed to be put on the backlog. Sometimes, in the rare case, it's fine to pull something directly into a sprint because it might be very urgent or something. But you should avoid that at all costs, because doing that disrupts the sprint. And it's the same, almost like a section in a production line. If you just chucking random things into that production line, it's going to be difficult to manage. But if you have a backlog of things and you say, okay, cool, when we're finished with this work we're doing now, then we will start taking new work. It works a lot better. We don't have to dig into too much of it, but he has 3 different parts to the simulated pull idea. So he talks about a holding tank and an active list. So it's same idea as the tray, where you have your tray of things, or your backlog in the software world of things that you can do, and then you have your active things in the software world, your current active sprint. But in the production line example, it might be, okay, there's the tray that you're pulling work off of, and then you have your active work that you're busy working on because you've pulled an item off. Then he also talks about intake procedure. That's just the way that you pull things in or get new things onto the backlog. So specifically, if you get a new thing onto your backlog or your holding tank, that backlog of items, you shouldn't just like chuck things on there willy-nilly. It should be you acknowledge that the item has been received. You give an estimate for, okay, we'll probably get to doing it in the software world. In 2 sprints time, we'll start getting to it. And you kind of have a rough idea of where it places, and then you communicate. And the key thing is just communication there.
I mean, it might be that just because of where you've placed it, the client might realize that it's not urgent enough and actually scrap it altogether.
Exactly, yeah. And then the last thing is the list cleaning, which is basically just saying, okay, don't just let that backlog of items get crazy and messy. Rather, every now and again, go through it, make sure it makes sense, make sure that you've got all the information that you need. Is it still relevant? All of those kind of questions. Cool. Should we head on to the next chapter?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is work at a natural pace.
Exactly. There's an intro story that would be helpful, I think, for Copernicus. So he says here at the bottom of the starting page, Copernicus's revolutionary ideas about planetary motion, for example, were sparked by a new commentary on Ptolemy, or a new commentary on Ptolemy published in 1496, which the young astronomer read when he was 23 years old. It wasn't until 1510, however, that Copernicus got around to writing down his theories in a working draft that he passed around to his friends. It then took another 3 decades before he finally published his masterwork on the revolutions of celestial spheres. The idea is going to slow productivity, work at a natural pace, and Copernicus is an example of that because, and Newton as well was the early example. It's not something that was done in a hurried manner. There was lots of things that had to happen, and it took time for him to read different things and digest ideas and then come up with drafts of maybe it's like this, and then refine that, and then try and communicate it with friends, and then decades later going to publishing it. And we often just see, Copernicus published on the revolutions of celestial spheres, and we think, okay, well, he did that in a year or something like that, or less. But actually,
it took
decades.
Yeah. I think we did touch on this earlier, that we see the end product, but we don't actually see the effort that was put in, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's about, but then it goes back that you had that idea and were able to foster it over a long time. You know, you just didn't have it and then let go of it. I think that's what's also important. You know, sticking things through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to give the definition there?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so work at a natural pace. Don't rush your most important work. Allow it instead to unfold along a sustainable timeline with variation in intensity in certain conducive to brilliance.
Yeah.
Settings conducive to brilliance.
Yeah, I mean, don't rush the most important work. Decide on what's important, and then don't rush it.
Yeah.
Done.
Done. Yeah, I think it might have been. I know I'll probably skip ahead. It might have been this chapter, probably the next. But it talks about how, it's actually this chapter. One of the not principles, things to bear in mind to apply.
Propositions.
It's proposition, and then the
ideas.
The ideas. Yeah. That's so it's not the main proposition, but it's
sure.
It's the idea, and it is about people forgiving themselves. You know, in terms of you probably give an estimate, and then you don't stick to it, and all of a sudden you're beating yourself up, like, you know, I think that's, you know, the whole thing, allow it instead to unfold along a sustainable timeline, because I think it says us as humans, we're actually overly ambitious, that we tend to think we can do things in a short span of time, and whenever we're given estimates, we need to double them. But I think failure to that, you need to then allow to forgive yourself. But yeah, I was just jumping ahead to just you know, those are the variations in terms of the intensity in which, you know, you can deliver that brilliance. I think it's just, I just feel like that's one thing that needs to be kept in mind by everyone. But we can go through the different sections, but then we'll get to that. I just read that, and somehow that kind of
popped into mind
that it's more important than it meets the eye, I think.
I think it's definitely a good one to keep in mind. One of the things that he starts off with as well is just he looks at the hunter-gatherer type of groups and their relationship with time, or relationship with work, I should say. And he says, you know, if you look at the hunter-gatherer groups, if there's a few studies on them and things like that, but if you look at them, you would think that it must be a really difficult and tough life because you don't have food and things like that. But then the studies kind of show it's actually they go and they have a little burst of effort, and then
Take a break.
a lot of their time is spent resting.
Yeah.
And even if they're going on a big hunt, like it's a lot of like going and then resting for a bit and then going and then resting. And so the percentage of time that they spend working versus relaxing is quite different to what we are used to with our 8-hour work days plus some extra because of the doing things over the weekends or this and that. And so our relationship with work is kind of extremely different to what is, in quotes, a natural pace. If you look at the broad overview of humans and how they interact with work and do work. So he says here, for our purposes, the key observation from Diebel's study is the uneven nature of the forager's efforts. A busy start to a fishing expedition might involve a long nap on the boat during the midday doldrums. An exhausting hunting trip may be followed by multiple days of waiting out the rain and doing very little. Rice farming in Agta, by contrast, work continuously the rice farmers in Agata, by contrast, work continuously sunrise to sunset when planting and harvesting. And we kind of get this progression from what we were used to doing as a species to what we do now. And it just gets more and more frantic over time. And Cal's like, let's take a step back here. This is getting wild, and we can all kind of realize it, which is why books like this exist now. Yeah. Draw us back in. Okay, so the propositions for how to achieve a natural work pace or working at a natural pace is 1, to take longer, 2, to embrace seasonality, and 3, to work poetically. So let's look at the taking longer part. The first part is just making a 5-year plan. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's too much to say there. Just having an idea of what you want to do in 5 years' time. So you can almost think about that missions idea. So what are your core missions over the next 5 years? And having those in focus will help you to not get pulled into 1,000 little directions, because you know that X and Y and Z are the things you're really trying to achieve. And these other little surface details don't matter all that much. But the big picture is what's important. And he's saying that will help us slow down naturally. Yeah. Double project timelines?
Yeah, the next is double. I think it's what I mentioned earlier about how we're very ambitious about giving time estimates. So whenever we give a time estimate, just double it. For safety's sake. Yeah.
And there's dangers there as well, because you can double it and then I can't remember what the name of the sort of effect or whatever that was coined is, but basically like things will take as long as you give them. And so there's a danger there as well. Okay. But yeah, I mean, I do think the general idea of if you estimate that it's going to take X amount of time, to say, okay, it's going to take twice as long as that is probably helpful. Yeah. But then not, balancing that with not then going and relaxing because you have the time. Yeah. And also not going on a whole bunch of unnecessary side quests that don't actually add much value because so keep that focus. And if you keep that focus on your core missions and things like that, and your focus on your projects and your daily tasks and things, then I think it's fun to look at doing something like doubling the timelines. But if you just like, I'll just double the timeline because I was told to, I think it's maybe not a good idea. So take that advice with a grain of salt. Cool. The next one. Simplify your workday. He says here, when it comes to taming your appointments, a good target to set is to ensure that no more than half of the hours in any single day are dedicated to meetings or calls.
Yeah, it's what I was saying earlier, that if you set a meeting, then you block off the same amount of time for work.
Yeah.
So in the end, then you have the balance. I know I can get that extreme. I was on a... Let me not. But yeah, it's very important. And also making sure that the kind of lean one side. So if you schedule meetings, say, I want to take meetings in the morning and nothing in the afternoon or vice versa. But yeah.
I would love to be able to do that. We'll get there eventually.
You'll get there. And yeah, the last one is the one that I skipped to, which is forgive yourself.
Yeah. No, he says that it's tempting to react to these periods of less productivity by assigning yourself a penance of crushing busyness. If you're exhausted, tell yourself you can't be accused of laziness. I want to push back on this reaction. Not only is it unsustainable, but it won't, in the long run, get you any closer to producing work that matters. Yeah. So, take longer. Don't beat yourself up about it. And another thing that he says on 136 is just that the key to meaningful work is in the decision to keep returning to the efforts you find important. So if you say there's these missions that you want to accomplish, whatever they are, if they are truly important, you will keep returning to them over and over again, sometimes doing better, sometimes doing worse. And there will be seasonality, and we'll touch on that now. And so sometimes spending more time and sometimes spending less time.
Yeah.
Similarly to Jane Austen. Jane Austen didn't all of a sudden, when she had time, then she all of a sudden now produced prolific work. But before that, she wasn't doing anything. She had always been trying to do writing and stuff, but then life gets busy and she can't get to it. And then she gets to it again a little bit. And then eventually she finally finds a way to get the time. She has the space to do things, and then she really draws down on it but it's that keeping on returning, despite the ebbs and flows of life, keeping on returning, and then that is the thing that will get you to be able to produce those really lasting, meaningful results. Yeah, same. I mean, we saw the same with Newton. We saw the same with Copernicus. Whatever. You guys know what I'm saying. Copernicus. There we go. Yeah. Okay. So that's the take longer proposition. Then there's the embrace seasonality proposition. Schedule slow seasons.
Yeah, it's one of it.
So, yeah, I think that's just a good idea in general, to not always be pushing full tilts and stuff, but to have these periods of like going faster and going slower.
Yeah. I think the next one is define a shorter work year.
Yeah.
I think that was interesting, and I think they speak about the one guy, Ian Fleming, the writer of the James Bond series, and how he, when he took on the job, I think asked for a 10-month year, 2 of which would spend in Jamaica, I think. And, that just allowed him to reset and, I wish I also had a 10-month year, but,
I mean, you kind of do, not 10 necessarily, but like 11. If you take into account all of the public holidays all of those kind of things.
I don't think my downtime doesn't come after 2 months.
I think you'd be surprised.
No, I don't think so.
I mean, how many public holidays do we have in South Africa? I don't know.
I don't think it's over 10. It's over 10. So then to 20. So I get like 30 days of solid.
And then you get 2 weeks off.
No, we don't.
14 days.
No, so we get 20 without
20.
Yeah,
Even more.
no,
So that's like a month.
No, I get 20, but that's part of the 2-week downtime. So
Sure,
that comes out of that.
Yeah.
Plus the 10 public. So that's what I'm saying. It's
No, I would love to have more as well, but I think we have more than we realize.
Oh.
Don't say that.
I want more.
But I do like the idea of like when there's public holidays and things like that.
Yeah.
Say there's a public holiday on a Tuesday, taking the Monday off as well. I've been doing that more lately, and I want to keep doing that more because I find that those sort of regular just breaks that aren't just a weekend, they're quite revitalizing. Define a shorter work year and then implement seasonality. We don't have to dig into a lot of details there, but basically trying to do things like having, if you can, one of the days a week where you don't work.
On my previous,
don't have meetings.
My previous project had that. We had no meeting Thursdays.
I need to do this.
No, like, if you can, do it.
It's amazing.
So, like, that's the only thing I miss about that. I hope people don't listen to this. I'm saying it.
You're digging a hole for yourself.
I am, actually. But yeah, we had no meeting Thursdays, and then to keep Fridays interesting. It was supposed to be casual Fridays. And that's the project manager that implemented that the Friday meeting was supposed to be like a fun sort of meeting.
Okay.
Like, and cameras on and whatnot.
Yeah, I like those kind of things.
But yeah.
He gives another example. See a manatee, I think is the word, once a month. Basically, he's saying see a movie once a month. And
I should actually do that.
How so?
Yeah.
I would love to. I love going to the cinema and just like watching. So his thing is saying like have these almost like little breaks that you have. And then another one that I thought was interesting is the work in cycles one. I can't remember Basecamp, the company, or who mentioned it, but basically the idea is that, say for example, you work in sprints. Maybe you can do 3 sprints where you like working solidly, and then you purposely have the one sprint to
fix bugs.
To just take it easy, and you don't have like such a frantic pace and things. Not that the other sprints should have a frantic pace, but just that like you have this rhythm of okay, we're gonna try and push a little bit now, and then we're gonna try and slow down a little bit, and we're gonna try and push, and we're gonna try and slow down, rather than just this like constant buzz of busyness. I think it's really great to try and...
I think you skipped one, but it's those schedule rest projects, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is actually a good one. The scheduling rest projects in the seasonality, where you essentially saying like the kind of projects where you want to do them and you enjoy doing them.
Yeah.
So take on a difficult thing, but then also take on a more relaxed thing. That's a good one. Okay, work poetically. That's 53. So let me see. 153, sorry. And so he says here on 154, he says, as French philosopher Gaston, I don't know what his surname is, argues in the Poetics of Space, we shouldn't underestimate the ability of our surroundings to transform our cognitive reality. The stairway is not simply a collection of raised steps arranged in a rectangular order, but instead where you played as a child with your siblings on a rainy summer afternoon. Its surface details are tangled into a complicated web of human experience. These forces affect our professional efforts. Oliver's forest strolls weren't about finding quiet. Weren't just about finding quiet. This outdoor context pulled on rich threads from her past, resulting in a perception of work that was more alive, varied, and natural in its pace than if she had those exact same hours writing at a perfectly nice home office desk. So, Scott loves to talk about this idea. One of my friends, he often talks about this idea of like space and the importance of having a space that is nice, whether it's going out for a walk in the forest or having just a home office space that is tailored towards your work. And yeah, we'll touch on that in a second. Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts there.
No, you can carry on. I mean, you might as well continue because it's
almost that end of the first working at a natural place.
Yeah.
So yeah, the working poetically, again, falling within the work at a natural pace, it's one of those principles. And in order to achieve that, he gives 3 ideas. One is to match your space to your work. Yeah. And I really like that idea. He says here, an obvious heuristic for constructing a more effective space for your work is to match elements of your physical surroundings to what it is that you're trying to accomplish. There's a few different examples that he gives there. And then, I don't know, I think you could probably tie these in together as well. He says, strange is better than stylish, and rituals should be striking. Those are the other 2 ideas tying back to work poetically. And the general idea is, if you're, for example, a Gothic writer, then to have your space be kind of resemblant of that. Now, that wouldn't work for me, and I wouldn't want that. But if you're a Gothic fiction writer, that kind of a space sort of can get your mind to flick over into a different way of thinking, and it helps you then to write more realistic, engaging novels. And the same with software. Like if you or engineering, if you often doing engineering, to have deconstructed tools or pieces of things that you need to put together, like having a space that has those kind of things around it. Like I would imagine James Dyson's offices. I think I've seen a few videos of his where they have the vacuum cleaners and this and that, like in the sections. And I think that's kind of helps you get into that mindset of creating and building things and thinking about how different pieces fits together. So I think doing that kind of stuff, and getting your space to make sense for the work that you do is really a good idea. Yeah. And then the last thing that he says, there's rituals should be striking, which is, I think it's again about flicking you into the correct mindset to have you do things that get you into a certain headspace. Yeah. He talks about the idea of the Greek rituals and that.
It's more like, it was more like an initiation of certain groups, like the process that they had to go through, and it was more of the experience that was meant to stimulating than anything.
Yes,
and I thought I made a note about it, but it's already what you said about how, you need to have all the rituals that, not that we practice rituals, but they're supposed to trigger something, like trigger a mentor into a certain space,
Yeah. I think, so it says here, the ancient Greek mystery cults, from those ancient Greek mystery cults, we learn something important about rituals in general. Their power is found not in the specifics of their activities, but in their transformative effect of the activities, or in the transformative effect the activities have on the mind. I think we've kind of touched on it already, but you might, I think for Cal Newport, he was saying, like, when he goes to reading, he often will make a cup of tea, and that's his sort of almost mental cue. Yeah. That's not a very striking example, so Cal, do better. But I think it is, like, even just something simple like that, to have it like some ritual to get into to some mode of thinking.
Okay,
All
I think
right.
that sums up that chapter or that principle. Work at a natural pace.
Yeah.
I think now we move on and hopefully wrap up soon.
Yeah. The last and final one is Obsess Over Quality. Cool.
So I should say, when I... Sorry.
No. Let's hear.
Today's been the worst.
What deviation?
Not the deviation, but it's like I'm coming in the worst of it. When I read this, I was like, oh, here we go again. Contradicting our previous book about the architecture.
Yeah.
Do you remember that architect when he spoke about being a perfectionist?
Yeah.
But then he brings it in. I'm like, okay, he kind of clearly states that there's a difference between being striving towards perfectionism to obsessing over quality. So yeah, when I read it, I was like, no, man, like, but, I had to...
There's always a balance.
I had to go through the process to sort of understand what point is coming from. And I think in his case, correct me if I may have understood it wrong, but it's more of being mindful of what you deliver, making sure that your end product is something that satisfies you.
Yeah. And
that's different from doing something then obsessing over how to improve it. It seems there's a fine line, rather, let me put it that way. So in this case, it's more about being able to understand that I'm not there yet and invest more to a point where, you are happy with. And again, the whole test scenario where you can look at, and I feel like most of us are in that space, that if we were to look at the work that we did 10 years ago and look at it now, we'll probably be like, oh, what was I thinking now? Oh, what was I thinking then? And it's just because we've been, and especially if you've been in that space since then, you've improved, in air quotes, your taste over time about that sort of work.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can carry on. But yeah, I just wanted to say that when I read, I was like, I had that moment of, here we go again, one book says this. And,
I think a lot of things, if you go back to the 24 hours a day thing, one of the things that they say in that book is, one of the things that my fellow man can learn is that the brain doesn't tire. It just wants us to switch between different tasks.
Yeah.
And I still think that there's definitely an element of truth there. We think that watching Netflix is relaxing and reading a book is tiresome. But actually, if you get used to reading books, it's actually not too bad. And it can actually be more satisfying than watching Netflix. Yeah. But we often think we aren't capable of doing this, in quote, hard work for extended periods of time. But, if you've ever seen people get into programming and things like that, you'll know that people can work a crazy amount of time without tiring, without burning out, all kinds of things. But then at the same time, if you look at the much broader scale, if you aren't doing things like the slow productivity, most likely you're going to burn out, or you're not going to achieve great things because you focus too much on the short term.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different things to balance. Obsess over quality, I guess. On page 170, I really like this idea, which is the dual. So that there's an artist that they talk about. We don't have to really dig into it too much, but there's an artist that was going to get this massive contract because she was performing well, and then she decides not to, and she takes the contract but not the money, and then she can focus on her artistic efforts, and it's a good idea in principle to go by. But one of the quotes that this artist says is, she adopted the motto for intentional approach: hard wood grows slowly. And it's just a great idea because it's very practical and it's just true as well. It's the similar concept to the whole acorns start small and then they grow into this massive tree. I like those kind of ideas. Do you want to take us on 173 through the general overview of the principle?
So, obsess over quality. Obsess over quality of what you produce, even if this means missing opportunities in the short term. Leverage the value of these results to gain more and more freedom in your efforts over the long term.
Yeah. So, one of the examples that he uses, I can't remember who it was, but there's a guy who essentially talks about how he had a job and he was earning, say, $50 an hour or something like that as a software developer, which is a decent amount of money.
100,000 a year, I think he was in there.
Yeah, and then I think he was doing freelance work and stuff. And then you have different options. You can go and scale up the business and hire more people and stuff like that. Or you can take the approach that he took, which is you can double your rate and then just have more free time and slow down and just take things easy.
But also because of experience, you're actually working faster. I think they included something like that. So in essence, he wasn't actually doing less work. He was just doing the work in less time.
Yeah. And that's that, like, in that definition of the principle of obsess over quality, that last part he says, leverage the value of these results to gain more and more freedom in your efforts in the long term. So don't not put in the effort. Don't not try and produce quality stuff. But when you get them, don't then go and rush to make more money or fill every now free second with more things. Like, take a step back, reevaluate what your missions are, and so he says here, the third and final, on 175, the third and final principle of slow productivity asks that you obsess over quality of the core activities in your professional life. The goal here is not about becoming really good for the sake of being really good at your job, although this is nice. As I'll argue next, you should be focused on the quality of what you produce because quality turns out to be connected in unexpected ways to the desire to escape pseudo-productivity and embrace something slower. So kind of with that example that we saw, it's if you work at quality, naturally things happen where maybe you get the work you produce is more valuable and therefore you can afford to slow down. So I think it's a good principle. There's the Jobs quote here. Deciding on what not to do is just as important as deciding on what to do. Yeah. So take that for what it's worth.
I think that's when they were explaining about when he asked the execs to choose what PC to get. They explained that, which was quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, not knowing which one they would choose, and then Jobs realizing, we should definitely simplify the product line. We're doing too much, and it doesn't make sense from a consumer perspective or business perspective, etc. Yeah. Before we get into the propositions, there's one more thing that he says that I thought was quite cool, which is on 182. He says, we've become so used to the idea that the only reward for getting better is moving towards a higher income and increased responsibilities that we forget that the fruits of pursuing quality can also be harvested in the form of a more sustainable lifestyle. So, I think we always look towards that, buying a better house, bigger house, better car, new phones and devices and all kinds of things. But if you shift that and starting a bigger business and all kinds of things. And there's nothing wrong with that, and it's really good that people do that.
If that's a bit of lifestyle you want, then
yeah, if that's what you want, great. And we in some sense need people that are ambitious in those ways. But don't get lost that it's currently the default to go if you're successful in that, but don't just realize that it doesn't have to be. So yeah. Okay. Should we go on to those last two propositions?
Yeah.
So he proposes 1, improving your taste, and 2, betting on yourself to get to that point of obsessing over quality. The taste thing, I don't think we need to read through it and that, but it's the story that we gave of taste versus ability, and sort of narrowing that gap between taste and ability, and that takes time. And then on 186 he says, and this is the story, when we idolize our glass style obsession with quality, we often overlook the importance of developing internal filters first. So that story that we had spoken about now is the Ari Glass story, and it's a good story, and he agrees with it in general, but he says that there's a point missing, which is the fact that you need to have a taste in the first sense. And he says these two, or this principle is about saying, how can we actually improve that taste to get to the point where we have a sufficient taste where we can say, okay, this is the gap that we need to now fill, and
produce quality.
Produce quality, yeah. So he lists 3 things: become a cinephile, start your own inklings, and buy a $50 notebook. I think we can gloss over them.
Yeah.
But a cinephile, he basically is just saying, look at different things, not just the thing that you're working on. Look at different things. In his case, seen movies, and he was obsessing over different aspects of movies, and that made him a better writer because he got different perspectives. And he summarized it there saying, understand your own field on 189, understand your own field to be sure, but focus on what's great about other domains. It's here that you can find a more flexible source of inspiration, a reminder of what makes the act of creation so exciting in the first place. Then the next one was the start your own inklings. I'm going to read the first little paragraph because I thought it's helpful framing. He says, in the mid-1930s, C.S. Lewis, a then professor of English literature at Magdalen College at Oxford University, started an informal writing and discussion club. He invited his friends to attend, including notably J.R.R. Tolkien, a professor at Oxford at that time. At first, they met every week or so in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen, where they would read works in progress and discuss their literary ambitions. They later added the tradition of meeting one morning a week for a beer and discussion at the Eagle and Child, a pub in the centre of Oxford. They called themselves the Inklings. So then he goes on to say on the next page, the Inklings was above all else a collection of Lewis's friends. Like most writing groups, their main function was an audience to listen and criticize and encourage. It is here that we find the exportable lesson of the Inklings. When you gather with other people who share similar professional ambitions, the collective taste of the group can be superior than the individual. When you combine the opinions of multiple practitioners of the craft, more possibilities and nuance emerge. So basically that's what he means by start your own inklings. Start your own group of people who care about that same thing, and you can bounce ideas off of them and get better ideas together.
I mean, it's now it's bothering me. It's like a principle in physics of like additions. You know, if you have wavelengths in the same phase, and then you bring them together. It's like the principle of addition, then they increase, which is exactly that. It's like people who essentially waves, and then the end result is better understanding, better knowledge of that field.
Einstein would be proud. Although I don't know that he liked quantum mechanics very much.
Oh gosh, yeah. That's just wave principle, so it's not quantum physics. And, NF.
193. It says here. Sorry. Let me.
Before you get there, I was gonna say that buy a $50 notebook thing. I feel like it's very true. I remember I once bought not $50 expensive type notebook, but up until this day, I don't think I feel that, because I'd always feel like when I'd write in there, I needed to write, there are scribbles now, but there was a time I was very obsessed in like everything written there has to be within a specific structure and whatnot. So if you do pay more for a notebook, I think you do become extra careful in what you put in there. But it was just interesting to know that he said whatever he wrote there was well laid down, and he actually produced a lot of articles from that notebook.
I think for some people this will work. For me, it might work now. I know it wouldn't have worked 5 years or so ago, because I did try those kind of things, and I bought like a fancy notebook and things and pen and stuff, and I just didn't write in it, similar to you. Basically just didn't use it because I was like, it's too important. So I think if you can strike that balance of like, you get the expensive thing, but then you actually use it, then I think you do get the benefit. But if you just buy it and then it just sits there,
you don't want to touch it.
That's sort of the I'll just give a little warning there. So if you do buy something expensive, just actually use it, and then okay, then betting on yourself. So that's the last proposition in Obsessing Over Quality. And he says here, the proposition argues that betting on yourself in this manner, with non-trivial stakes for failure but attractive rewards for success, is a good general strategy for pushing the quality of your work to a new level. So it's, if you whether it's like, I suppose he gives some ideas for that, so maybe we'll look at those ideas. So he says, right after your kids go to bed, reduce your salary, announce a schedule, attract an investor. So, right after your kids go to bed.
Straightforward. Take them to.
Exactly.
I think that was more of filling a space kind of thing. I looked at it in that sense that, you don't want to do something when there's distraction. Not that kids are distraction, but in the moment you can't parent and write. So once you put your kids down, that time after that and before you go to bed, it's time that you can use to write. That's if you're a writer.
He gives also a qualification there on 205. He says, the spare time strategy, of course, is not a sustainable way to work in the long term. Sacrificing too many of your leisure hours to extra work can violate both the first two principles of slow productivity. But when deployed in moderation, dedicated to a specific project for a temporary period of time, this act of giving up something meaningful in pursuit of a higher quality can become an effective bet on yourself. So I think he's kind of nicely wraps up the idea of seasonal work there, with also not violating those first two principles, the working at a natural pace and limiting the amount of stuff you're doing. So, and that can produce quality because of that focused time, like you said. Reduce your salary. He says, committing your free time to a project is one of the easier ways to bet on yourself. A more drastic option is to rely on the project for income. Few forces induce more focus than the need to pay bills. It's here, however, that we wander into some potentially dangerous territory. In American culture, there's a romantic appeal to the idea of quitting your stultifying job and pursuing a grander dream. And then he goes on to say, we should rather find a balanced strategy. We don't haphazardly quit your job to pursue a more meaningful project. Wait instead to make a major change until you have concrete evidence that your new interest satisfies the two properties. First, people are willing to give you money for it. And second, you can replicate the result. I think those are very good and wise ideas before you just jump ahead to reduce your salary. So yeah. Cool. Last one?
Last two actually.
Last two, sorry.
It's announced the schedule. So I could be wrong, but the way I read that is more of kind of say putting yourself out there. So even before you get to the point, tell your friends that this is what I'm interested in doing.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's this social credibility aspect comes in there, where you're putting your social credibility on the line, saying you're going to do this thing, and then if you don't do it, then there's the social cost of the fact that people are like, you didn't do that thing.
Yeah.
I want to add a caveat. I don't think he adds this caveat, but there's also, I'm sure, in another book that we've read, the idea of not telling people. If you want to lose weight, tell people, because the thing is, if you go and like tell everyone, then you get the dopamine hit from being like, cool, it's like you've already done it.
Yeah.
Whereas if you just go about quietly trying to achieve your goal, so I would almost say I don't know that it's a good idea to announce the schedule, but it kind of, I suppose, depends.
I think it depends on if your work is already in the pipelines. So I think it's it's hard to announce your schedule about losing weight. Unless you've been losing weight and wearing like a suit on top, hiding your body, and then all of a sudden you'll be like, new body revealed in 2 weeks' time, and then you kind of,
Sure, yeah.
I think that's a kind of announced schedule in my mind. In this, it's more of, I'm going to put on, let's say, an exhibition in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah.
But you've already, if it's a digital, you've already taken the pictures. Why not? You just need maybe a bit of post-production and then hang them up type of thing.
Yeah.
So it's already in the pipeline, and you kind of like sit in the ground when it's due, if I may say.
Yeah. I think maybe there's a difference between like announcing the schedule just to your friends versus announcing it to like the broader public or to someone that you view as like maybe your boss or someone. If you announce something to your boss, generally you feel a lot more pressure to get it done.
I mean, that example you gave, to me, you'd want to announce it to someone that would keep you accountable. So I wouldn't be all against it, but I hear what you're saying, that the pressure from it is higher. And disappointment is even greater if you don't achieve it and then you have to go on. So, And the last one is attract an investor. So I don't know if you...
Yeah, that's he says when someone has invested in your project, you'll experience amplified motivation to pay back their trust. This is true for investments of financial capital, but it is also true for investments of sweat equity, such as when a friend helps you build the sets for theatrical production or spends an afternoon stuffing envelopes for marketing campaigns for your new business. Attracting other people to invest in you and your idea is a dramatic bet on yourself and your ability not to let others down. In the drive to avoid this disappointment, greatness can be found. So, I wouldn't say that we've achieved greatness here, Peter, but I think the like social investment for me into or for you into me, helps me continue to read the books. And I'm sure the same is true for you, to read the books, to do the podcast once a month, all of those kind of things. And I think it helps with us getting better as readers, getting better as hopefully people, because it's something where we've attracted an investor, to use his phrasing, that has now invested time and stuff. And if I was to not rock up to record the podcast, you'd be like, James, what's going on? And the same vice versa. So I think that general idea, I wouldn't necessarily recommend the money side of things unless you want to add stress and you are very entrepreneurial. Then, although my boss would also be like, don't do the money thing because it limits your options a lot. And Jewel, that artist, would also say the same thing. So the money part, maybe not, but the social side of things, I think it's a good one. All right. That's it for the quality, obsessing over quality side. Should we quickly run through the conclusion part? And then I'll just quick highlights and then we're done. So he says in the conclusion, I have 2 goals for this book. The first focus is to help as many people as possible free themselves from the dehumanizing grip of pseudo-productivity. And then his second goal for the book applies more broadly. The world of cognitive work lacks coherent ideas about how our efforts should be organized and measured. So thinking back to the fact that we use the industrial metric rather than a better metric. And then he says, my long-term wish is that this movement kicks off many others, creating a marketplace of different concepts of productivity, each of which might apply to different types of workers or sensibilities. So he's given some examples of how to be more productive in the knowledge work realm. But there might be other realms that also need that different view of productivity. I could imagine the creative realm and things like that. Not that knowledge isn't creative, but Then he says, slow productivity, more than anything else, is a plea to step back from the frenzied activity of the daily grind. And lastly, if you collect modest drops of meaningful effort for 365 days, McPhee reminds us you'll end up with a year with a bucket that's pretty damn full. So, and that's slow productivity. Any final thoughts and conclusions?
No, nothing. I think it's just more of, constantly reminding oneself about the different principles and just how to work them into your life. That's the only thing I can think of. And that's for me as well. There were some interesting bits that I'd look into taking up. I would need to, I think, every now and again just go through the principles and just to remind myself, and just to, I think I also need time to just, I know it sounds very, but just to think through my life as well. I think it's just given me a lot to kind of consider and I think it's not a bad idea. I think I shy away from I don't want to say putting myself in a box, but kind of identifying what it is that I need. I think subconsciously I do things. The taking on lesson. And I think 2 years ago I decided, okay, let me have my own evenings or reduce the number of things I do in the week and whatnot. So subconsciously there are things that I implement, But I think just to be more disciplined about and more, how can I say? More disciplined and actually sticking things through, I think, should be helpful for myself. So I just advise people that if they can, they can get a copy. If not, look, just get a summary and look through the different principles and just see how they can help improve their lives. I think we don't know we being consumed by pseudo-productivity up until someone says it, and I think it's just it might work for others, not for everyone, but I think it's just important to look at both sides of the coin, and see what works for you. So those are my last thoughts. So.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the idea of slow productivity and the slow food idea and all of those kind of ideas, because it reminds me of 4,000 Weeks, that book, and I really enjoyed that book and the sort of way of approaching dealing with life and interacting with life and letting things take the time that they take. And so it reminded me a lot of that, and I really enjoyed that. And it also, similar to what you said, it makes me think, okay, let me take a step back and reevaluate what are the core missions that I care about. What are the things that I want to focus on and spend time on, and does my general the things that I do day to day, does that line up with that? And also not getting too sort of forceful on myself to I have to do this absolutely every day. I think there's very good things to having rhythm. If we go back to The War of Art, Stephen Pressfield's book about what is it like to be an artist, and that, and there's the whole idea of rocking up. Inspiration strikes at 9 o'clock or whatever it might be. And I think there's lots of value to that, and I don't want to lose that in this idea of slow productivity and the allowing the ebbs and flows of life to happen. But I also do want to allow the ebbs and flows of life to happen, and that seasonality idea that he touches on here, and having periods where it's working more and at certain times and working less at other times. And a last thing is that it made me think about taking more little trips on weekends and things like that.
Oh, finally, that bug has bitten you.
Yeah, we'll see if it actually has bitten for you. But just the idea of escaping to whether it's going camping or going to a holiday house or something like that. We don't have a holiday house, but
invite me, please.
Renting a guest house or something. Renting a guest house. None of these things are making sense, but I think everyone understands what I'm saying. But I think that general idea of escaping, going to a place like Tsitsikamma, Jamie and I really liked going to Tsitsikamma, and places like that. Yeah, and just escaping to there. To then be able to take time to reflect on things, to read slowly and not feel rushed, to just be present in an environment and allow it to inspire you in various ways and to calm you down and things. And I really like those ideas and thoughts and principles to take away. So I think those key takeaways, those 3 principles, the do fewer things, the work at a natural pace, and obsess over quality, and his previous ideas of craftsmanship in that quality sphere, and becoming a craftsman at the work that you do and really spending time to get good at it. Yeah, I think those are all very valuable ideas to take away. Cool. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, James.
Until next time.
Cool.